Welcome to the Wounds That Do Not Heal. My name is Tressa Brady. After my own experience and hearing time and time again about domestic violence in military families, I decided to start this podcast. Tune in for stories, resources, and guidance on how to get the support you need for your family and your safety. I was 25 years old when I met my ex-husband. At that age, everything that I knew about domestic violence, I'd learned from watching a Julia Roberts movie in the 90s, Sleeping with the Enemy it was called. Now, this was post Pretty Woman, so I'd seen all of Julia Roberts' movies at that time. She was wildly popular, and I was obsessed, as was the whole world. But this particular movie really stuck with me. I just couldn't wrap my brain around how a woman could be afraid of her own husband. It didn't resonate with me. I'd only ever been in a loving home and modeled a healthy relationship. So the idea that a woman would fear her husband hurting her was so foreign to me. Now, if you're too young to have heard of this movie or you just never saw it, I think you can actually go rent it right now on Amazon or Apple for like $3. Don't read the reviews. They're crappy and they call it like basically a Lifetime movie, which is a compliment. But it did really, really well in the box offices because this was, again, the 90s when thrillers were really coming into their own. This, of course, was the same era that gave us like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Cape Fear, Misery, The Good Son, The Silence of the Lambs, all of those thrillers, right? And so then you think about domestic violence being in that category, and you realize that in the 90s, nobody was talking about domestic violence. So at the time, it was a thriller, which is really sad. But anyways, you might want to earmuff the next part if you haven't heard it, because spoiler alert, even though this movie's 33 years old, but consider yourselves warned. The premise of the movie is that this woman is married to a man who's just incredibly physically abusive and controlling. And so she has to fake her own death to get away. It's her only chance at survival. And of course, he finds out and he comes for her. He comes to kill her. And her only option is to kill him in self-defense or be killed herself. And it's actually basically the same movie that J-Lo did a decade later called Enough. And I really, really liked both movies. I just never, ever dreamt that I might find myself in a similar situation someday. I actually remember having a conversation with my dad shortly before I finally escaped my ex-husband, but the conversation I was crying. And I remember telling my dad the only way that the relationship could ever end was one of a few ways. First, he'd kill me and then probably kill himself. Or kill me and get completely away with it because the military would look the other way or help cover it up. Or he would die in combat, or I would kill him in self-defense. But I truly felt that's the only way that the relationship would end because he would never willingly let me go. When I did try to leave or get away, it could never be amicable. He would just absolutely torment me. There was no, mature conversation saying we aren't good for each other. We should just move on. There was no hope of amicably separating and doing so in peace. He just couldn't let go. And he would make it absolute hell. You're either for him and with him, or you are against him. And when I think back to those thriller movies that featured domestic violence and now Lifetime movies, the thing about those movies is that those women in those movies, it's very clear to them that he's very dangerous, and to those around them. They can even see, and those women are having to wear long sleeves or come up with stories about falling down the stairs to cover up for these physical injuries that are happening to them. But when you're in a relationship that's emotionally abusive, you're not necessarily, it isn't as obvious to those around you. You aren't wearing long sleeves and covering it up and making excuses, but it's just as dangerous. It is just as dangerous as those relationships where the spouse is beating the victim. And I believe there's actually around 15 states right now with laws that are against this type of emotional abuse, which that wasn't the case back in 2007, 2012 when I was married to my ex. I even went to the military for help and they did nothing. But today, states are recognizing how incredibly dangerous this form of abuse is. And this form of abuse is actually called coercive control. That's when the abuser exploits their victims, deprives them of independence, and regulates their everyday behavior. Now, there was a sociologist named Evan Stark who actually sadly just passed away, I believe, last month. May he rest in peace. He did a lot of amazing things for victims of domestic violence. And he actually wrote this book called Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life. And he spent decades of his life researching and advocating for victims of partner abuse. And he did a lot of amazing things for the community while he was alive. I highly recommend the book. So I'm going to put it in the show notes. It really helps shed a light on the dangers of coercive control and even the tactics that abusers will use. He and his wife were both pioneers in domestic violence, and he challenged a lot of misconceptions about domestic violence in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even into the 2000s, mainly that it was always physical. People would say things like, he's not abusive. It can't be abuse. He didn't hit her. He would even testify in court, and other lawyers would say to him, well, she never got hit. It wasn't self-defense, right? That the woman killed this man because she had battered wife syndrome. But he challenged that. And he said, blaming women for staying in abusive relationships is like blaming a kidnap victim or a hostage for not leaving or for finally retaliating. When we see women who end up killing their husbands, people will say she could have gotten away. She didn't have to do that. There's actually a court case I've been following right now in the Midwest. I'm not going to name the woman or the couple involved because I'm going completely off of my own hunch. But this woman shot her husband and he died, and military. And people all over the internet are talking about how crazy she is. And this poor man was a victim of her craziness. And they're basing that off a meme she had posted in the weeks prior to his death, where the meme was essentially like a joke that said her husband told her she was crazy, but he hadn't seen anything yet. Like a little funny meme. And that's what people are basing her being crazy off of and her doing this. But I always think there may be a kernel of truth in people's jokes or sarcasm. I post a lot about how I dress like Adam Sandler, and there's definitely a lot of truth to that. But I actually saw her post in a different way than most people did. They saw as her testimonial to how crazy she actually was. But in my experience, men that are abusive will always try to paint their significant others and their exes as crazy. I mean, think about it. If you're here listening and you're the survivor of abuse, what kind of wild tale did your abuser tell you about their ex? Mine convinced me that his was this gold digging, cheating, loose woman who stole his car and money. In reality, she was like this hardworking, gainfully employed, intelligent, sweet Christian singer woman who he had abused mercilessly and stole her dog and vandalized her home, and she fled the state to get away from him. He told his second ex-wife that I was a drug addict, like street drugs, which is actually hilarious because I've never even done gummies. Like I've never done drugs. It's so out of whack. That's probably why he said it. Like some part of him gained satisfaction as painting me to be this person that I wasn't anything close to. He told his family and friends that I took his money and left with another man, which the irony is I left all of our money and all of my savings and our joint and everything that I owned and my belongings. The only thing I took when I fled was the clothes on my back and my dogs. I pawned my wedding ring for gas money. I mean, I took nothing. But these abusers will gaslight you into thinking you're crazy and also gaslight those around you to make you look crazy. So when I see this woman posting this meme, it makes me think that he was saying to her that she was crazy and she was mad and she posted that meme. I have a hunch we'll find out he was abusive. But again, I'm not naming the couple because God forbid I'm wrong. I don't want to add pain to his family and friends. When women do retaliate and they're in court, the prosecutor trying to prove that in the moment she could have fled, will always say, you could have gotten away, couldn't you? You could have gone out the back door. You could have done this or that. But for a woman who's been a victim of domestic violence, you know that if you have any tie to them, children, there's no escape. There'll just be years of torture. And I think one of the hardest things for outsiders to understand about those who are in abusive relationships is how come they stay? Or how come once they leave, why would they ever go back? It's almost like they don't buy the abuse is actually happening or that it's as bad as the victim says it is. Because who the hell would sign up for a life like that? And who would go back if they've gotten out, right? But I left and went back. And in fact, last summer, when I went and testified against Chris on behalf of Faith, his lawyer, a female, she actually had the audacity to say to me when I was on the stand, after just hearing this long list of all these horrible things he'd done to me and being fully aware of all the crimes he'd committed against Faith, she says to me, "So we're really supposed to buy that all of these horrific things, all of these things he did to you, and you stayed. And not only that, you once escaped, got out, and went back. We're really supposed to buy that?" And I was sitting there like, yeah, lady, that's what the cycle of abuse is. The cycle of domestic violence is literally that. You go away and you come back with promises of him changing, and he's good for like maybe a week and it's blissful. And then the abuse starts over again and you leave and he torments you. And that post separation abuse is so horrible, or the promises of him changing are so grandiose that you hope and you go back. And you're just chasing that high of them being nice to you, but then they do horrible things. And it's just this vicious thing where you're going back for a number of reasons and you stay for a number of reasons. And we'll talk about all of that. But man, it would be hard to sleep at night as a defense attorney. I understand that this country needs defense attorneys because there are innocent people on trial in this country and wrongfully convicted every day. And everyone deserves the right to an attorney. And I'm thankful for this judicial system. But I'm just saying, if you're out there and you're that attorney who said that to me, or an attorney who has ever said that to a woman on the stand who is the victim of domestic violence, and you happen to stumble upon this podcast for some reason, you knew everything that the man you represented did, and you still were able to defend him. Like, may your pillow never be cold, warm on both sides for you. And when you're laying in bed at night on that warm pillow and you cannot sleep, may you just replay domestic violence victims' tragic endings over and over again in your head, because defending men like that gets women killed. And interestingly enough, moments later in court, he was actually berating her while she was sitting there. And I was thinking to myself, yeah, you don't like it so much, do you? But I digress. Anyways, many people actually have this thought process that that lawyer had, that you can't possibly understand why a person would go back. But there's a lot of mind control, and there's truly a grooming process. And there's a reason it's called a cycle of abuse. And abusers will seek out empaths. They come in like knight in shining armors. And I always say, beware of the knight in shining armor, whether you need one or not. I certainly did not. I was actually in a way better financial and housing situation and all of that than my ex was when I met him when I was 25. Long story short, he came in like a knight in shining armor, even though I didn't need one. And he had me on this pedestal. I guess they call it love bombing now, but he just bombarded me with these grandiose gestures, and he just found a way to become involved in every single aspect of my life. And he was so attentive, and his attentiveness made it seem like I was the center of his world. And like I'd finally met a man who sees me and appreciates me. But soon enough, that attentiveness becomes an obsession, and an obsession to dominate you. And eventually, my ex-husband controlled what I ate, what I watched on TV, what I wore, who I talked to, when I went to bed, the shampoo I used, you name it, he controlled it. And it didn't happen overnight, because if they came in hot like that, who's going to go on a second date? But they groom you and they get you there to eventually where you just feel like no matter where you turn, you're suffocated, and they've chopped off your limbs. Like they have every part of your life just entangled with theirs. And you know, if you disobey them, say something that they don't like, that their reaction and their explosion, their tantrum is going to be so huge, and the fallout and the repercussions are so unbelievable. The rage that you just won't disobey them. It's not worth it. Like, he's going to have a meltdown if I dress like that. I won't dress like that. He's going to freak out if I hang out with Becca, because he doesn't like a strong, opinionated woman. So I guess I'm just not going to hang out with Becca. So you're constantly, catering your every decision to his desires and on eggshells, because he's monitoring every aspect of your life. And I didn't recognize those signs early on because he packaged it as being caring. And that's where the danger is. At first, you're the center of their universe, and it's almost addicting, that feeling like you've hung the moon and stars for a person and they see you as perfect. But as soon as those feelings of adoration subside, that obsession and that hyper focus will begin to feel like he's orbiting around you to, dominate your every move. And you're so taken in those first few weeks or month that even when their mask slips or there's a red flag, you'll dismiss it and you'll tell yourself that's a fluke. That's not who he really is, because like I said before, you're just chasing that initial high of the person you met, that amazing person. And now add in that layer of your partner being a war fighter or a first responder, a fireman, a police officer, a paramedic, someone who has a very good reason to have trauma that is causing physiological responses in their body that may explain some of their tantrums and rage and snapping on you. It becomes very easy for a spouse to give them a free pass. That's why it makes abuse from these type of people so easy. You become so susceptible to it because you give them that pass, like I said. They absolutely have a reason to be acting out, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous for you to be with them. Now, I actually tried to leave several times, as most victims of abuse do. And every time I did, the suicide threats would start. And like I said, abusers like these, they'll often seek out empaths, and they know that somebody who's especially empathetic is really going to respond to a suicide threat. They know that as soon as they say they're going to hurt themselves, you'll go running back. And for me, I honestly thought it was just as likely that my ex may die by suicide as it was that he was using that threat of harming himself just to get me to come home. So that was one particular tactic that it was like my logical brain knew he's not going to die by suicide. But my heart would say, what if this one time he actually means it and he goes through with it? How would I ever forgive myself for not going to help him in his time of need? And so I would always fold and go home. And he would tell me later, "Oh, I wasn't really suicidal. I just wanted you to come home." The thing that always worked aside from suicide threats was him threatening my friends, my family, their well-being, or my beloved pitbull Hefty. He was my reason for keeping on, right? Like, we didn't have kids, and my life had become so miserable that despite the fact that I'd never been super depressed or lost the will to live, I had become incredibly just, I felt there was no will to live. He'd stolen my will to live because every day was just miserable and I was so depressed. And Hefty was keeping me going. I just wanted to keep Hefty safe. On my darkest days, that dog was my reason and kept me going. And that's why Chris used him as an abuse tactic. He would steal my dog. He would threaten my dog. At one point when I left, he actually had a lawyer send a letter to my sister's house that said that those were his dogs, and he was going to try to get custody, which was such horseshit. Unbelievably manipulative and maniacal. And we see this with people of abuse who have children, right? The abusers who may not have been particularly present or involved parents, you leave them and all of a sudden that's their child that they want full custody of. They're the best parent in the world. And in my experience of watching two of my closest friends go through custody battles with military abusive men, or any man in general, doesn't have to be a military person, any human who's not a particularly present parent, but you try to leave them and they want full custody and they're painting you as the bad parent. They're the custodial parent. You're terrible. But when you look at the nitty gritty, like, they don't know what your kid's shoe size is. What's his teacher's name? Who's his best friend? What does he want in his packed lunch for school? They don't know any of those things because you've done all the hard work. You've carried the weight of mother and father. You've done it all. You've been the nurturer, the caregiver, the custodial parent, the protector, that child's safe place to fall, all of it. And all of a sudden, you've left them and they want full custody. And they'll do anything to make you look bad to get that full custody. The fact of the matter is, even if they were awarded full custody, they'd likely just drop that child off at their mom's because they don't want to do the hard work in the first place. In my experience, what I've seen is they're doing this for one of two reasons. One, They don't want to pay child support. They'll do anything to protect their finances, which is particularly interesting because I've seen these men spend 80 grand on lawyers trying to get custody of their kids or lawyers trying to screw you over instead of paying you 20 grand. It's totally nonsensical. They're their own worst enemies. They'll do detriment to their own credit to ruin yours. They'll spend every last penny they have on a lawyer to make sure you don't get a cent. It makes no sense. And then second, of course, it's to either drive you home because you're not going to be separated from your child or just to hurt you in general. And you may be thinking when he's going for custody that you're going to protect your child, right? You start thinking, okay, what if he does get 20, 30% custody? What if he only has my children every other weekend? I will not be there to protect them. I will not be with them. And so you just go home because you think that it is better to be there to protect your children than to let your children be alone with him. You've always been the one to take the brunt of the abuse because you've been there. So many women will go home and God forbid he gets full custody. This will drive a lot of women home, of course. But I did talk to a psychologist and I look forward to sharing that interview. But he did tell me it is better that your children have one safe place than to be in the home with you and the abuser because children are very receptive and they see and feel that toxicity and they're stressed by it. And the psychologist said, "You're enough, mama. You are enough." One parent that a child can form a healthy attachment to is enough. And one safe place for that child is enough. Being out of that abusive home is better for the child. It's better to be from a broken home than living in it. And we're going to get more into that later on how abusers will use children as a tactic to hurt women and to get them to come home. So one of the other tactics that I've seen and even experienced myself that abusers will use to drive their victims back home is they will file fake police reports. And my ex would even go to get a temporary restraining order and claim to be the victim of abuse himself. And then when he had that temporary restraining order and the police were trying to serve me, he had a GPS on my car at times. He would show up where I was and call and say I was there. I mean, so many just crazy tactics. And the police would be calling me and trying to serve me. And I'm literally living in my car trying to hide from him or couch surfing on friends, just doing whatever I can to hide out. And he's claiming that he's scared of me. They also use cyber attacks and hacking you. My ex would constantly hack my email. He also did something called caller ID spoofing, which I'm not trying to inspire anyone here to do this, so don't do this. But he would call me and I would look at my phone and it would say, "Oh, your mom's calling you. My mom's calling me." So I'd answer the phone and it would be him. Or he would use caller ID spoofing to send himself harassing texts, but it would look like I did it. Just so many things. He would hack into my emails and then send himself threats from me to him, hacked from my email. He would send those I knew and loved and friends and workers and stuff emails from me. My only saving grace was that he couldn't form a grammatically proper sentence, and I'm very good at grammar. So those who knew me well would be like, "This isn't from Tressa." But it was a tactic, and he would look up my search histories and go through my texts and everything. I was constantly monitored. There are actually apps in present day where they can even see like your keystrokes and everything you're doing. So you need to be very, very, very careful at what you're looking up on your own devices if you're trying to leave. One time my ex actually went to the great length to cancel my car insurance, and then he waited a few days and called to report me for driving an uninsured vehicle. Another time when I'd left, he reported the car as stolen, and he failed to mention when he made that phone call that I was his wife. So the police came to find me and arrest me for stealing a car. And I was like, "Oh, this is my husband. He's just trying to get me to go home. I didn't steal this car. Here's the title. Here's proof, whatever." "Wait a minute. You're his wife? Doesn't matter if it's his car or your car. You're married. This is community property." And they'd leave. But all of these things, you just want to make them stop. And you start to feel like you're burdening your friends and family with all of this stress. And so you do go back and you tell yourself, maybe you'll get help. It's the war, it's the trauma, or you blame the alcohol. Now, I do want to do an episode about addicts and abuse because a lot of women think that it's the alcohol or drugs making your partner abuse you. And that could be a part of it. That could be making it worse. But I do have another book I want to recommend. It's called Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men by Lundy Bancroft. I'm going to read an excerpt. This is about partner abuse not going away when an addict recovers. So the person in this book asks the question, if he stops drinking, will he stop abusing me? And this is the author's response. During the first several months of recovery, a man's harsh daily criticism and control sometimes soften, and any physical violence he was using may lessen or cease for a period, raising the hopes of the abused woman. She interprets this respite as confirmation that the addiction did indeed cause his abusiveness, but his behavior towards her gradually or abruptly reverts to being as destructive as it was while he was drinking. Ironically, the man's backsliding tends to begin precisely as his recovery from addiction starts to take a solid hold. The early period of recovery is all-consuming. The compulsion to drink is intense, so the alcoholic fights a daily internal battle, often holding on by a thread. He may even be attending one or more substance abuse meetings per day, which occupy his time and maintain his focus. One result of this Herculean effort is that the man has little time, energy, or mental space to devote to controlling or manipulating his partner. He's entirely self-focused and absorbed. But when he starts to come out the other end of this white knuckle process of early recovery, his energy and attention are redirected toward his partner, and his desire to bully reemerges. Actually, it's not uncommon for abusers to get worse when they are in recovery, partly because they become irritable from not drinking and they take it out on family members. Other abusers become more controlling when sober than when they will drink, standing guard with eyes that are no longer clouded by alcohol. Perhaps even more important is that an abuser's recovery program tends itself to become a weapon to use against his partner. Once he stops drinking, for example, he may turn around and insist that she is alcoholic too, even if she actually drinks moderately. He starts to criticize her for being in denial about her own drinking, a concept he has learned at his meetings and about which he now considers himself an expert. Insulting comments about her drinking habits and pressure on her to give up alcohol and join AA are very likely to follow. The abuser also can use specific concepts from AA against his partner. For example, AA encourages participants to review their own faults and misdeeds and make an inventory of them, and discourages criticizing or focusing on the shortcomings of others, which is known as taking someone else's inventory. The abuser turns this concept against his partner so that anytime she attempts to complain about his abusive behavior and how it affects her, he says to her, "You should work on your own issues instead of taking my inventory." Similarly, he uses a danger he might drink as an excuse to control her. For example, when he is bothered by something she does, such as confront him about his bullying, he says, "You're getting me stressed, and you know I might drink if I get under too much stress." The accusation, "You are threatening my sobriety," becomes a new tool that the abuser uses to hammer and silence his partners. Abusers thus develop new excuses for abuse to make up for the fact that they no longer can blame it on being drunk. So we'll talk more about sobriety and addiction and abuse in a future episode. But many soldiers and first responders are using drugs and alcohol to self-medicate. As I mentioned in the first two episodes, they can't go get a mental health diagnosis or it could jeopardize their career. So they're numbing their pain with alcohol. So this might resonate with a lot of you who are victims of abuse from first responders. There are so many layers to coercive control, so many ways the abusers will cut you off and control you, but I want you to hear this next part because it is imperative that victims of coercive control understand this. In 20% of domestic homicides, the murder was the first act of physical violence the perpetrator committed, but they were always preceded by coercive control. The man never hit the woman until he killed her. Now, every day, 3 women in America die by domestic partner murder. Just because he doesn't hit you does not mean that he's not going to kill you. In fact, the leading predictor of domestic violence murders are controlling men. That's it, ladies. That's the number one behavioral clue that he could kill you. It's not whether or not he hit you. It's not whether or not he pointed a gun at you. It is whether or not he was controlling. When these controlling men lose control of you, there's nothing they won't stop at. The states now that are enacting laws against coercive control are focusing on a wide range of behaviors that usually indicate the person is coercively controlling their partner because they're seeing these connections between homicide and coercive control. So if the next things I say impact you or reiterate that the person you're seeing are showing signs of being controlling, pay attention. The behaviors that are indicative of a coercive control include isolation, economic abuse, which we'll be talking about in depth in a future episode, monitoring, and that may be monitoring your text message, emails, wherever you go. My ex monitored how far I went. Like he looked at the mileage on my car when I got home and would bring up how far I went to make sure I didn't leave his boundaries. And my ex actually monitored my food to the point of caloric intake. And that goes along with the next part, which is degradation. They'll degrade you. They want to make sure you know you are beneath them and you shouldn't leave because you can't do better. Now, I was really fit when I met my ex. I'm living that toddler life right now. So, mom bod, but it's the season I'm in. Anyways, I was really fit in my 20s. And when I was with him, I was part owner of a gym and a personal training business, and I did fitness competitions. And still, like a lot of women, my weight fluctuated, and he didn't like that at all. If he came back from deployment and I was a smidge heavier, he would be really upset. And so he dictated what I ate and he made comments. And early on, it was things like he would come in when I was changing and like pinch my side and make a comment about, oh, getting a little fluffy. But as time went on, it got worse and worse. And the degradation was just terrible. He would look to see if there were wrappers in my car and in the trash of things he didn't allow me to eat. And he would pack my lunch sometimes and I had to eat his approved plan. And he would put me on a diet, which is ironic because he ate trash and I had an education in nutrition. So, but he really created some terribly unhealthy eating habits and a messed up relationship with food that I've struggled with for decades. And what's really sad is when I went to testify against him, I had to submit this timeline of events that highlighted a lot of his behaviors and some of the really terrible things that he did. And Faith had to do the same thing. And it was so her lawyer could look at those things and question us about it on the stand. And one of the things that we both had was comments about how he would rage more if our weight wasn't how he wanted. And Faith even had like during this time frame, he was really upset with her about gaining some weight. And might I just add, this was baby weight. She had had his 2 children, and she's a knockout. She's drop dead gorgeous, totally fit. This guy totally outkicked his coverage with his fiance before me, myself, and his second ex-wife. But he wanted to let us know that we shouldn't leave him because we couldn't do better. So he constantly, he was upset if we gained any weight. And we both had things like he smashed the countertops. He flipped a table on me. He caved in the hood of my car and he caved in the dashboard of her car and all of these things. And he constantly broke our phones. But we also both had things about his unhappiness if we gained weight or that it was going a little bit better. He was pleased with us because we'd lost a little bit of weight on the diet he'd required. So control tactics with your body, your weight, sex, all of those things, very, very common with coercively controlling men. Other behaviors, of course, I've already mentioned. They include verbal abuse, threats of harm, threats to release private information, revenge porn, or anything you might not want to get out there. Damaging your property, like I've mentioned. I can't even count how many phones that man broke. He broke everything. If a day went by where something wasn't broken by him, I'd have been in shock. So some states consider any act that limits a person's right to freedoms of movement and association to be coercive control. Anything that causes a recipient to have fear of violence or alarm or distress that has a substantial effect on the recipient's day-to-day activities. But abusers will actually accuse victims of parental alienation as well. And if you aren't familiar, parental alienation is when one parent tries to poison the children against the other. But some of the things I've seen in family court is that the accuser is usually the one committing the parental alienation. Like the victim of it doesn't attempt to bring that up. They just want to get away, right? But the one who is actually poisoning the children, the abuser, will accuse the victim of that in court and try to get custody of the children and the children taken away from their safe parent. And that's one of the reasons many, many women go home, custody, to keep custody of her children. Now, it actually takes a victim of abuse about 7 attempts before they finally leave their abuser. For me, it was at least 7, and the same is true for Faith. And unfortunately, the abuse after each attempt will often escalate as they feel like they're losing their grip on you. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons that women don't leave is fear that their abuser will kill them or their loved ones. And statistically, the likelihood that their partner may murder them if they leave is extremely heightened during that time. For that population, those who are murder victims, 75% of those victims were in the process of leaving or had recently left. It's an incredibly dangerous time. So hear me when I say, if you're trying to leave an abuser, you have to be hyper vigilant. Do not go meet them to talk one last time. Do not believe them when they say they just want closure. They're okay with you leaving. They need to see you one more time. Do not hear them out. Don't go anywhere. They're going to be alone. And if you don't have a gun, or if you don't know how to properly use a gun, get yourself some pepper spray. You have to be so aware of your surroundings, and you have to be really careful. If you're looking up ways to leave or safe places to go on the internet, you make sure that's not a device he has access to. Go to a public library if you can. I know a lot of you are in dire situations where you're monitored so much you couldn't even do that. But if you are doing those things, please be very, very careful about how you do that. They're probably monitoring you. There's apps now where they can monitor your keystrokes and see everything. Please be smart. Now, if you listened to my last episode with Doc Springer, she talked a little bit about how the abuse can be predatory or reactive. And that makes sense to me, right? Is your partner losing his shit because he can't regulate the physiological conditions in his body happening, and he's just snapping and flying off the handle, and the rage and the throwing things and the breaking things, the tantrums, all of those things, it's out of his control because he has a physiological condition that he needs to get help for. That I can understand. Or is it premeditated and it's an attempt to control and dominate you? For me, my ex was both of those things. He did things like think far enough in advance to cancel my car insurance and try to get me in trouble for it. To me, that's not losing control. Like I would think that over like a week-long period, you wouldn't still be in that lost control status. But I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know what PTSD can do to your ability to make rational decisions. And that's one of the things I want to look into. When they're doing these really maniacal things, can that be because of damage from PTSD? Can someone's trauma cause them to make these terrible decisions and really try to just ruin your life? Either way, you staying with a person doing those things, regardless of why they're doing those things to you, is not safe. And that's why, I want you to be safe and talk about getting him help. And we want to get these men help, but we really need to make sure you and your children are safe. One of the things I want you guys to do is look up the social media profile of Dr. Christina Cocciola. I'm going to include that in my show notes, and I've actually had a chat with her. She's going to be on the show. So that's someone you want to follow. She is an expert on coercive control. She's an expert on parental alienation and the family court system and all of the horrific things that happen there. And she has a lot of wonderful resources on her webpage and her Instagram. And for you, if you're a victim of coercive control, you're going to find a lot of things there that really pertain to you. There's also an account called Me Too Family Court. She posts some really amazing things. Go look there. I have nothing, I have no like partnership or anything with these ladies. They're just amazing, and they'll have a lot of resources for you. So if you're a man listening to this podcast today and you've hung on this long, Thanks. You might be listening to this and thinking that you listened to the second episode with Doc Springer and that really pertained you. That was really interesting because she shared a lot of things that men can do for mental health help. But you might be thinking like, this has nothing to do with me. This show's not for me. And it's true. We're going to pop back and forth from victim perspective and how to help the abuser, because I truly believe that we cannot help these victims if we do not help the abuser. There's this systemic change that needs to happen, right? And so I want to help both parties. Also, even if you've left your abuser, if you have children with them, you're still going to be impacted by their mental health issues. And so I want them to get help to mitigate the impact on you and your children. But if you are that man and you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm a little bit controlling, maybe this will help you get yourself some help. But if you're not controlling and you're thinking, I can't get anything from this show, I would ask you, do you have a daughter? Do you have a sister? Do you have a loved one who might be experiencing these things? Because it's very, very common. And I think that every parent, regardless of whether your child's male or female, because coercive control can go both ways. But every parent needs to learn about this because teen violence rates are so high. And I think a big part of that is the connection with phones and social media. They can have more control of each other. You know, when I was a teenager, the boys had to call on the phone and I had to answer the phone in the living room in front of my parents with that long cord to the wall and sit there in front of my parents and be like, hi, like super awkward. And it was just so different. Now, if you have a teenager who's shooting off 200 texts or receiving 200 texts in a day, that's not healthy. And if you see your daughter's behavior or even your son's changing, they're not going out, they're not being as social, they're changing the way they dress, they're hanging out with different people or not hanging out with people at all other than the girlfriend or boyfriend, you have valid concerns. And I think you should go check out Dr. Cochiola's page because she does have some webinars and different tools you can look at to see how you might help your teen learn what healthy behaviors are and to keep them safe. There are so many parents right now who sadly have become advocates for educating teens on intimate partner abuse because their teenagers were murdered by teen partners. And it's not talked about enough. And we need to bring awareness to that. So please check out her page. And again, thank you for listening today. If anything that I've said today has really resonated with you and you want to share your story on the podcast, or maybe you just need to vent to someone and know that someone will read it and shoot it out into the web universe on a safe email, send it to me at healingwounds13@gmail.com. You can find me on any of my socials in my show notes. And in our next episodes, we're going to be talking about men's mental health and the stigma for them receiving help. We'll have resources for men on that show. We're also going to talk about economic abuse and some of the unique aspects of military life that lends itself to enable different types of abuses. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And as always, please stay safe. If you're trying to leave an abuser, be extra vigilant. And remember, you're not crazy. It's not you. And don't lose hope. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you think this content would be helpful for someone you know, please share the link with them. Sources can be found in the show notes of today's episode.